So what I'm going to do in the next hour or so is to review the deep rupture that occurred in Europe in 1989 and look at the developments since that time in countries that now belong to the EU and which until 1989 were part of the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon. We had a lot of celebrations in commemoration of the events of 1989 in Germany and elsewhere. I was in Prague, I was in Warsaw, and all the same remembrance of the events of 1989. The breakdown of the old regime and the beginning of a new one. And this year, compared to the similar commemorations in 2009, 10 years ago, were less joyful, less celebratory, and very mixed mood that political elites, of course, try to overcome, but not everyone was happy with what happened in the period under review. So I will review what happened in this period and what needs to be done, or what construction sites, if you forgive that metaphor, are still open and in operation. The years of Eastern enlargement, as we call it in the West, and accession, as it's called in Central Eastern Europe, on which I will concentrate. Okay, the events are accession and Eastern enlargement in 2004, 2007, 2013. There were 13 new member states from Europe 15 to Europe 28. Two of them were 1.5, one should say, Mediterranean small islands, and the rest were 11 post-communist states. So I'm not talking about your country, about which I will be happy to learn more the days I'm here, but I'm not talking about what perhaps is of greatest interest for you. So let me start by distinguishing two modes of historical change. One takes place in a slow process. The history of the Cold War comes to mind, the history of decolonization, the victory, the ideological and practical victory of neoliberalism since the 80s, the Reaganomics and Thatcherism in the 80s, globalization and European integration. These are processes where the movement is slow, and we speak of decades to get hold of the real changes. In contrast, there are these fast processes of which the transition from state socialism to democratic capitalism is one example. So the longest distance from the old regime to a new regime is perhaps in Poland, where the Solidarność movement started in 1980 and was victorious in 1989. But in other places, like Czech Republic and Romania, the process was much faster and took place in months or even days in Romania, right? The Christmas Revolution, the breakdown of the regime, ending with the killing of its leader. And I remember sitting on a plane in August 1989, and I picked up a paper, and this paper, the British Independent, predicted that within the coming months, about 1 million people would move from west to east. And I put this paper on the desk in front of me and said, I thought this is a serious paper, The Independent, but how can they make such absolutely unrealistic predictions, I thought, right? Of course, they were right and I was wrong, but the surprise factor, the suddenness of the events was a characteristic of the period. Apart from wars and proper revolutions, nothing works so fast in history with this transition, without a war, and without, one could argue, a real revolution. And the months from April 1989, February actually, 1989, with the roundtable negotiations in Poland, to the official end of the Warsaw Pact in July 1991. This period was full of dramatic, unanticipated, sudden, and most consequential events. A breakdown of an international regime of major importance. So the breakdown was limited, one should say, and one should remember, to the European cases of state socialism, with China, Vietnam, and Cuba being immune, or almost immune, to the changes that took place in Europe. So this suddenness and surprising character is an important feature. Two questions for social scientists, two questions follow from this sudden event. One is, what were the causes? And why did no one predict, or hardly anyone predict, the breakdown? How come it was so surprising? And the second question, of course, is that of the consequences. And both questions are dealt with academically and also to an extent politically by a new science or discipline, political science discipline that developed in this time. In English is often referred to as transitology, the transition studies that apply to that era. And I'm not speculating about the causes, and there is no definitive answer so far. There are more than one answer, which is, of course, the basis of of different readings of the history. I'm not a historian. I gladly leave the answer to the question, what were the causes of this breakdown, to future historians or present-day historians. I want to discuss some of the consequences and the problems that these consequences caused. Transitologists operate with a sequence of 3 phases. First, the breakdown of the old regime, then the founding of a new one, including privatization, constitution making, the formation of political institutions, parliaments, political parties, and so on. And thirdly, the question of consolidation. People get used to the new institutions, they know how to operate them, and everyone expects that these institutions will stay in place for the foreseeable future. They are taken for granted. That is the sign of consolidation. Also, an operational definition of consolidation is 2 changes of government. And this is the political aspect. The economic, of course, is a slow process of economic consolidation where investments, consumption, markets, property rights, civil law in all its facets is being established and no longer questioned as something that is held to be contingent. That is, other possibilities are still open. Right? This is consolidation, a very important concept. So, but the consolidation is obviously not yet completed. It is, if anything, people speak of both economic and in particular political deconsolidation of the process. There are surprises, often unpleasant surprises, in the process. The anticipation was that within 10 years, all these 11 countries would become what they called themselves normal countries. The Polish saying was, we return to the West and we want to be a normal country with the problems that are easily manageable and which are seen to be under control, economic and political problems. No surprises to be expected for the future. That is what we mean by consolidation. Consolidation has not taken place. Instead, there are a number of challenges and unresolved problems which are under construction. That is why I'm using the metaphor of construction site. Number one, to rebuild a society after, in most cases, a period of 40 plus years that is built on private property, on labor contract, and on price formation in markets. That is a capitalist economy, and the institutions that belong to it, is a process that is unpredictable and challenging because, as one author, Ivan Zeleny, a Hungarian, has put it, it is hard to build capitalism without capitalists. That is, without people who are used to the practices and institutions and expectations that are normal in a capitalist society. And okay, there are no capitalists before. You don't know how to run firms. You don't know to whom belongs what. And the idea of labor being based on contracts rather than on status. Important distinction, right? Contracts can be terminated, status cannot. In the Soviet system and the Comecon system in general, unemployment was something virtually unknown. Now it affects, in the beginning, more likely 20 rather than 10% of the population. They are not used to this. Wage determination through trade unions and the right to strike are all novel institutional mechanisms that you have to get used to before they can be consolidated, right? This is, there were no small and medium enterprises, which we see also in East Germany, a merchant class, a commercial class that knows what property and contractual relations are, is absent. So what we have instead is what one colleague has called a rule-less and institution-free, brutal or wild capitalism that this colleague called grab and run capitalism, right? You try to do a business, but then you run away because you fear revenge, and there are many stories from the early 90s, from the Soviet Union as well as other countries, where this wild or raw capitalism prevails. How do you privatize? No one knows. This is a historically unique event, the transition from state socialism to capitalism. How do you transform state property into private property? And who is going to benefit from this transfer of property? Do you do it through management buyout? That happened in many countries. Do you do it through voucher privatization, as they try it? Every citizen gets vouchers and can trade the vouchers in order to obtain property. Voucher privatization, as they did it in the Czech Republic. Do you auction the property to the best paying clients? Or do you leave it to oligarchs to appropriate resources in the primary sector and other sectors? How do you do that in the absence of banks and central banks who give you credit for building a business? This is all unknown. This is all questions that are do not have clear answers, and therefore are contested and conflictual. So economic privatization, the building of a new economy, a process that took place in countries like France, or in particular England, over a long period of gradual transformation of a pre-capitalist into a capitalist society. Now you have to do it in a very limited period of time, and you don't know how to do it. And Western models may be helpful, but it is also questionable whether they can be applied to the situation at hand. Second, construction site. You need to build not just civil law and courts and stock exchanges and banks and private property institutions of a similar sort. I remember I was in Slovakia doing interviews in 93 and 94. One expert in the Ministry of Labor told me there is not a single person in this country, in Slovakia, which was about to split from Czech Republic, who understands what a stock exchange is. So the knowledge needs to be introduced, and without a business press that helps to understand these things, you are lost in a unpredictable, chaotic, anarchic kind of market-dominated economic environment. Let me come to the second, namely the foundation of political institutions. You need to build a constitution or rebuild a constitution which includes political parties, the rights of parliaments, the rights of territorial units, districts or regions or Länder. You need to build mass media, independent mass media. You need to build schools and universities, public administration, and so on, municipalities, incorporated territorial actors. And again, if you don't know what to do and what examples to follow, there are many in different countries in the West that could be used. Which one to pick and which one is compatible with others are all open questions. And they are still open in many places where there is a constant tinkering with institutional patterns that may or may not succeed in the process of consolidation. Germany, if I may speak for a moment on my own country, is the only case where one of four possibilities of territorial reorganization of states applies. The four are you stay as you are. Poland, in the same borders, except Poland had three neighbors before 1989. It has 7 reconstituted neighbors with entirely different foreign policies, international policies after 89. And this is an enormous change, but the Polish borders stayed where they are. Second, separation. All 3 cases of federations have separated. Czech Republic, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia have separated. They have fallen apart. The third is the German example, where one nation is reunited, as the German term is, wiedervereinigt, reunited. And then you get a case that may be of particular interest to you, namely fragmentation of territorial units at the initiative of foreign powers. And that applies to the eastern neighborhood of the EU. Your country, Georgia, and Moldavia are countries that are territorially disorganized in processes that are well known to you. So this is my short discourse on territorial reorganization in addition to institutional reorganization of the polity. Constitution making is something very, very demanding, and some countries have not yet managed to build settled constitutions that last for a while. I mean, very often we have the pattern that every 2 years new articles are inserted in the constitution. So, my third point. The regime changes, the economic as well as the political regime, and everything that follows from it changes. But the people stay the same. I mean, you have to build a new system with old people, people who have grown up in the old regime. And then the question is that of transitional justice. What do you do with the people you have inherited, as it were, from the old regime and who are used to a very different type of regime? And you want to do it in a way, as Václav Havel said, we are not like them. We are not arbitrary. We want to have a orderly, rule-based, independent legal process by which punishments and rewards are to be redistributed to the perpetrators of crimes of the old regime very often, and to the victims of these perpetrators. So the conflicts of the old regime are inherited. They are still with us. And you can destroy the symbols that have survived, the statues, the buildings, the art forms of the old regime. I was in Tirana in a fantastic, I recommend if you ever go to that interesting country, look at the Museum of Modern Art that is divided into three departments. One is Preuss, socialist realism. The second is socialist realism, and the third is post-socialist realism. But that's not. I'm not going to describe you this very interesting museum. But if you look at the back of the museum, hidden behind the garbage containers, you see a collection of statues of Hoxha, Stalin, and Lenin, which have taken off their places and assembled in the backyard of the museum, partly destroyed or half destroyed, but all recognizable. And that is one way of dealing with the old regime by the new regime. You just take the statues away, but the monuments, destroy the monuments, but keep it as a historical piece of evidence, as it were. So, what do you do with it? You have criminal justice is not the right place. Doing nothing is not an option. Opening the archives is a very popular demand, although not always. Sometimes it takes 2 years, sometimes it takes 20 years to open the archives of the secret police of the old regime, where all the dirty secrets are to be found, who cooperated, who spied on their neighbors, and so on. This is not just, but clearly a big problem in the German case, where you have three periods of transitional justice, the new regime dealing with members of the old regime. One is West Germany after 1945, the other is East Germany, the GDR, after 1995, and then United Federal Republic after 1989. And very different methods were used. So after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, the party of the old regime was outlawed, but the people were moving up in many positions, sectors like judiciary, universities, economy. So the reverse took place in East Germany or in Germany after 1989, where the party was allowed to continue, but the people were not eliminated physically, but removed from their jobs through processes that the Czech have invented the term that is not popular or not common in other languages, the process of lustration. That means the symbolic cleansing of places that have been infected. So this is the old Roman. So what do you do with the old regime, which helps to build trust and helps to spread a sense of justice? And this is a problem that many regimes, new democratic regimes, had to face in Latin America, in South Africa. In Latin America, it was the term truth commissions. We want to find out what the old regime did and make it public. Truth commissions. In South Africa, it was called Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it is still an open question whether reconciliation actually follows from truth, knowing the truth. Now, knowing the truth can incite you to vehement conflict rather than reconciliation. So this is a problem. Let me add one point that comes to mind in the connection with Poland, the Polish transition. The use of the files and archives of the old regime can be that of a political weapon against your present-day opponents and political enemies, and that seems to be there. Fourth construction site is the fragmentation of many of the societies along identity dimensions. By identity, I mean ethnic, linguistic, and religious dimensions. And the formation of ethnic parties that you have in quite a number of these states, and the surprising significance of identity issues in newly democratizing societies. And very often it is the case that these ethnic conflicts are not conflicts because people belong to different ethnicities. They are ethnic conflicts of the following kind. We, the majority population, resent the presence and the rights of others because they are external minorities of former imperial countries. Examples are Russians in Estonia. They are resented because they are the external minority of Russia. Or Germans in Poland, Russians in the Caucasus, in Georgia, Hungarians in Slovakia, in Romania and Serbia, Serbs in Croatia, and of course Turks in Bulgaria. So again, a case of long arm of the past, the remembrance of people who live among us, but they are a bridgehead or suspected as a bridgehead of a former imperial power is what drives these conflicts, and they have been very deep and serious, these conflicts. I mean, in Estonia, for instance, to give you an example, Russians who have lived there all their lives, ethnic Russians, were deprived of the right to vote and to write their own property unless they speak Estonian, which they never thought of doing, right? Are able to speak Estonian. And that was in the early 90s, and this then later was more civilized, but they are still considered as foreigners among us, and foreigners who are guilty among us, namely guilty of occupying us or bossing us around. So a problem that is not completely settled in places like Hungarians in relation to the three neighboring countries, namely Romania and Serbia and Slovakia, where they have Hungarian minorities that are privileged by the Hungarian government and which cause a lot of animosities in these countries. My fifth construction site. The process that takes place in the transition from state socialism to democratic capitalism is strongly determined by foreign powers, by foreign intervention, by foreign domination, and the power asymmetry that emerged in Europe between Western Europe and East Central Europe after 1945. So external actors, and prominently the EU and its organizations, but also the IMF and other international organizations, including NATO, orchestrated the process of transition. Political parties, religious communities, trade unions, academic institutions of all kinds, foundations, and investors all played an important role in shaping the transition process. In 1993, the EU adopted 3 criteria, the so-called Copenhagen Criteria, for the future admission of Central East European member states to the European Union. This was a deal, but a very asymmetrical deal in the following sense. The West determined what are the conditions for accession, what are the criteria that must be fulfilled by the prospective new member states, and the new member states had to conform to these criteria, which were political, economic, and administrative normalization. The new member states had to adopt all the EU law, and this lasted for a while, but it formed a deal, and in the course of time, this deal was seen to be frustrating to both sides. Both sides were frustrated by the results of the deal. The West was unhappy, to put it mildly, with the institutional reform and the legal situation in the party politics and the authoritarian tendencies in the new member states or the prospective new member states. And the Easterners were rightly unhappy with the failure of convergence. They were granted market access, markets, product markets, labor markets, but that did not result in a economic approximation. Let me cut this short. If we can come back to the question and answers on this. Number 6, social security, distributional justice, welfare state services in the areas of health, housing, and education, the prevention of poverty, that is what we call social policy, and the formation of trade unions and collective agreement systems were very deficient under the auspices of austerity and neoliberal economic doctrines in the East, and a deepening discrepancy between metropolitan areas and rural and small town areas, also in electoral behavior, were to be observed. And to create social security is a project that is still in many of these countries and to a large degree unfulfilled. Poverty is very widespread, partly also because the urban elites, and I come to this in another point, have lost many members who emigrated to other places, mostly in the West or to Australia and Canada. So social policy, I mean, in the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the East European Bank, as it is normally called, has very interesting data on both capitalism and political life under democracy in the new regime. And they asked the question, are you satisfied with the results? They did so in before 2010 with the results of market economy capitalism and the results of democratization. And interestingly, only the most wealthy third of the population and the youngest third of the population said yes to both questions. There's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the outcome of the transition, and that led to a widespread attitude of blaming capitalism as well as democracy for the misery that prevails in many of these countries. Point 7. And that has to do with migration, outward migration. The panic that, for instance, in Hungary and to an extent also in the demographic panic, as Ivan Krastev has put it, that prevail in many of the countries, particularly in Hungary and Poland, is the following. As so many people move out of our country, they have to be replaced. And who can replace them? People coming from outside of Europe. And we do not want that. We are afraid of a situation, and rightly so. I mean, between 10 and 20%, and it's sometimes above 20% of all working age people have left the country in places like Poland, like Estonia, and that, of course, undercuts the prospects for future economic growth and prosperity. So the more people flee, the more people flee. And this is a spiral that creates deep concerns and unrest about the future. Number 8. After the accession, the conditionality mechanism is no longer operative. And I mean, there are very open statements by the ruling party in Hungary who say, well, we have waited so long, we have bowed to the dictate of the Copenhagen Criteria, but now we are free. Now we have access, and now we are free to become ourselves. The famous and very smart slogan by Mr. Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is the following: we thought for a while that Europe will be the future of Europe, of Hungary, sorry. Europe will be the future of Hungary. Now we know that Hungary will be the future of Europe. Now we do as we please, and we are no longer bound by the institutional and political premises set in Brussels. And that allows us to treat migrants and refugees and asylum seekers according to our standards rather than according to European law. And that is a reversal of the power relation, and the EU is unwilling or unable to do something about it. Number 9. The territorial question I've already touched upon, namely even in Germany, the divide between East and West in terms of economic performance, in terms of voting behavior, in terms of political parties is quite marked, and so is the territorial divide in Europe as a whole. I do not want to elaborate on this more. Again, I can answer questions on this. And the 10th and last of my construction sites is the political behavior, voting behavior, political allegiances, and the prevalence of a sense of fear which drives an outburst of populist mobilization in Eastern countries, not only in Eastern countries, but much more in Eastern countries than in Western Europe. We have the Hungarian and Polish examples where rightist populist parties form the government. We have other examples. The Estonian example again comes to mind, where newly formed parties enter into coalition governments with the newly formed rightist populist parties, and they have clearly authoritarian inclinations. The freedom of science, the freedom of the media, the freedom of political opinion is not guaranteed by them, and many people speak, rightly so, I think, of a reversal of the process of democratization. De-democratization, deconsolidation are terms that you find in the literature, and the defense of rule of law, constitutionalism, division of powers, and basic rights is something that is at risk today more so than it was ever in the last 20 years. Now let me conclude. what is the difference? There are two differences, not often highlighted, between the development in Western Europe after the Second World War and Central Eastern Europe. Western Europe had two sociological features that were absent in Central Eastern Europe. The one is the presence of large segments in the population of foreign-born populations, be it in the post-colonial situation, Britain, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and France, that people from the former, and England, of course, people from the former colonies had citizen rights and lived in the country, were an everyday experience in schools, in factories, in restaurants, and so in London. You are used to people coming from the West Indies or from Pakistan as a post-colonial fellow citizenship, right? A group of fellow citizens. The second was the second element in the foreign population that we in Western Europe were pretty much used to and taken for normal was the so-called guest worker wave that came in the 50s and 60s from all Mediterranean countries, mostly. So ethnic diversity and plurality was a very common element, which was not the case in most of the Central East European countries. For instance, it has been said that the GDR was the most ethnically homogeneous country worldwide, because they had 1% guest workers. They were hidden away in some special settlements, and 1 million Russian soldiers, Soviet army. They were also in their barracks. You never would encounter them in everyday life if they were not working colleagues. You would not meet them in the supermarkets because they had their own supermarket. So absolute homogeneity. So that was a deep difference. The second major difference was that in the West you had the movements of '68. And that means the peace movement, the women's movement, the environmental, the urban movement, and that had a lasting effect on the liberalization of the political culture, and such things you have never had in the East, or very little of it. And the major failure of both state socialism and what came after it, in my view, is the fact that there was no institutional capability to engage in an unbiased self-monitoring of social facts and social events and social developments. So-called, this paradox, so-called scientific socialism was unable to monitor by independent autonomous agency what was going on in society. You had no accurate accounting system. You had no independent media. You had no court system. You have no independent science that describes and analyzes and evaluates what is going on. And this level of unawareness of social facts is something that was bound to lead to the crashing defeat that the state socialist system had to undergo. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be pleased to answer questions or answer to discussions.